purchasing prostitutes for propaganda purposes. Media propaganda does change perceptions and people. And we see that USAID has been busy purchasing prostitutes, what should be journalists, but they've become prostitutes in my term, for propaganda purposes. We should recognize the media is not a reflection of reality. In this case, much of the media is a reflection of USAID, CIA, and US State Department policy. In our goal of smashing cultural Marxism, Jesus said, "You shall know the truth, and the truth shall set you free." Now, Jesus is the truth. He is the way, the truth, and life. But it's also a principle that truth in general is good, and truth does not fear investigation. But you can see a lot of people screaming blue murder because Elon Musk and his Department of Governmental Efficiency, or DOGE, is out there investigating. And how dare anyone investigate government expenditure? And you would have thought it's a good thing to investigate expenditure. I think we need DOME, Department of Mission Efficiency, and DOSE. We need Departments of Church Efficiency too. I think in my experience in missions over the last 40 years, there are all sorts of things that go on that could be a cut. There's some unwise expenditures in every department and businesses, but businesses will tend to do it more often. Governments will do it almost never. First time I went to the United States of America, I got to hear Ronald Reagan speak, and Ronald Reagan's one of the greatest communicators I've ever come across. And he said, the closest thing to eternal life you'll see this side of eternity is a government program. And it's true, when a government program is going, it just seems to develop eternal life. It just carries on and on and on. They never seem to cut it. And Elon Musk has found people who did a 3-month job for a government department and were still being paid 40 years later. Wow. Which, as I said, has got to be corruption, has got to be kickbacks, but people will spend taxpayers' money easier than they'll spend their own, and they don't need to check up on, is it worth it, and so on. And so the deep state's massive payroll for media puppets has been exposed. When you think of fake news, disinformation, misinformation, and journalism, it's been funded by USAID. Just think of CNN or the Clinton News Network reporting on the insane BLM riots when they were dismantling and burning down whole cities, looting shops, burning down the Minneapolis police station, and standing in front of this burning building, the CNN reporter said, it's a mostly peaceful protest. Like, you know, do they think their viewers are blind as well as stupid? Just exposed by DOGE is USAID was funding 6,200 journalists, 707 media outlets in 30 different countries. This is staggering, and that includes South Africa, by the way. We've got newspapers in South Africa like Mail and Guardian that were actually USAID projects. And who knows how many individual journalists in South Africa were on the payroll of them, where they've been given a task to do a hit piece on this person or that. And you're talking about billions and billions and billions of dollars have been poured into media propaganda to purchase prostitutes, as I call them. Take Politico, $34 million from government agencies in America. They were the first group used to launder the Biden campaign laptop disinformation, that the Biden laptop, Hunter Biden's laptop from hell, as they called it, full of not just pornography and films of him taking drugs while doing all kinds of perverse acts, and the corruption, including how corrupt the Ukraine government was, that this is Russian disinformation plant. They knew from the beginning it was real, but Politico was launched particularly to say this is a Russian disinformation so that all the other news media could quote them as a source. This is the way, you know, proof by Wikipedia. And I've got these people who check things out, and so you get one journalist to quote the source. Now, they're the only source. Unnamed sources have declared. Now, it's published, so you can quote that as your source. And then New York Post quotes Politico, and then Washington Post quotes Politico. And then they can all quote one another, and then Wikipedia can put all three as sources. Meanwhile, they're all just quoting one unnamed source, but the initial Presstitute was Politico. They were the ones who got it started. Politico has, you know, full-color papers, very high-quality paper and so on, and full-color covers, not too subtle sometimes when they were really promoting the Hillary Clinton campaign. New York Times. You would have thought New York Times a real serious newspaper. $50 million from various government sources. We're talking about just last year, including a staggering $26 million from Health and Human Services. Why would Health and Human Services, effectively Department of Health, need to be funding the New York Times? That's a lot of money. I mean, I could think of a few things we could do with $50 million. I mean, goodness me. Reuters, $9 million from the Department of Defense for, quote unquote, active social engineering, defense, and large-scale social deception. That's the stated reason, large-scale social deception. $9 million from the Department of Defense to Reuters, as well as $220,000 from the Department of State. Now, why would Reuters, which many people think is an independent news agency worldwide, meanwhile, they Presstitutes for USAID, which is the same thing as saying for the CIA. And then the Bolshevik Broadcasting Corporation. British government TV, which, by the way, is funded by what they call licenses, which is some kind of compulsory. You own a TV set in Britain, you've got to pay a license to the government, and that goes to BBC. So BBC is well funded with tax money anyway, but they get another $3.3 million from the US government, an eye-popping $20 million from Bill Gates. Why? Bill Gates, why would he be putting $20 million into BBC? Maybe this explains why the BBC was promoting the masquerade madness, COVID cult, lockdown lunacy, salvation by vaccination scam, because they paid Presstitutes of the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation and so on. And there's dozens of other examples. The BBC specialized in manufacturing disinformation on a scale you could not even begin to imagine. They're the mouthpiece of slave masters. Don't forget to pay your £145 a year TV license fee to receive live propaganda 24 hours a day. Many people forget that George Orwell, who wrote 1984, worked for the BBC during the Second World War, and he modeled Mini-Truth, or Ministry of Truth, in 1984 on the BBC. 1984 is treated by many governments today as a manual, but it was meant to be a warning. And George Orwell had been a policeman for the British Empire in the East, and then he became a propagandist for the British at BBC during the Second World War. And in 1948, he wrote the book 1984, just converting numbers, where he was prophetically warning about the dangers that could come in a dystopian future. And he based Mini-Truth, or Ministry of Truth, the Ministry of Propaganda, on the BBC. I think many people miss this. When I read 1984, which was a separate book at school in Rhodesia, I thought it was modeled on Moscow and Russia and Stalin. But it was based in London, in Airstrip 1, as they called England. And it was all, and even a man had a real English name, Winston Smith. And so George Orwell was actually warning about what could happen in Britain, not just warning about what was happening in Russia. Big Brother is watching, and now we know they really have been. George Orwell warned, the people will believe what the media tells them they believe. Political language is designed to make lies sound truthful and murder sound respectable. That's why all mass media reporting sounds exactly the same. It's funded and directed by the same source. Media outlets' narratives are a carefully orchestrated scheme to influence public opinion and political outcomes. Millions of people are going to die from COVID virus. Remember, hundreds of millions worldwide, millions just in South Africa will die from this. You have to lock down, you have to social distance. Vaccinations are safe and effective. Safe and effective. Did we mention to you? Safe and effective. Say after me, safe and effective. And this chorus went around the world. Well, they're all being funded by the same people. And that's why a lot of media sounds like an echo chamber. And they've even got, maybe you've seen some of these where they've literally synchronized a whole lot of screens and all the people are saying exactly the same thing. Different news crews in different studios, but it all sounds the same. They're singing off the same chorus sheet. And yes, it looks like there's a lot of different media outlets being represented, but it looks like they're all controlled by the same source. And we now know that a lot of what was happening on YouTube, Google and Facebook was actually being censored. Even though they claimed at the time, no, there's no censorship, there's no shadow banning, that's not true, deplatforming and so on. But Mark Zuckerberg has admitted we did deplatform hundreds of thousands of people, and we deleted 8 million posts in 2020. And the FBI and the CIA came to them and bullied them to do this, they said. So it now appears that USAID has been a key puppet master for a lot of the media, what you thought were independent journalists. Gore Vidal said, when you control opinion, as corporate America controls opinion in the United States by owning the media, all the media in America is owned by effectively 6 businesses, 6 corporations own all of them. You can make the masses believe almost anything you want and guide them as you please. Now, if you think of junk food, fast food for your body that you get from McDonald's and so on, well, CNN and BBC and CBS and ABC, they are garbage for the mind. And they really are. I mean, it's fast food, fast news, fast history, fast everything, but it's garbage. It's about as healthy for your mind as the McDonald's, Big Macs and so on are for your body. And as for Slime magazine, they've been promoting scum for a long time. I mean, this dirty, unwashed, mass murdering, killer, bank robber, thief, scum, Che Guevara, front cover of Time magazine, along with Mao Zedong, the #1 mass murderer of all of history. And we've got Khrushchev, yes, we will bury you. Remember that? So this is a real commie cover, red cover with the red stars, well. As for Newspeak, the second coming. Now, abortion isn't legal because of Obama. Abortion is legal because we live in a country that dares to print such sacrilegious nonsense. I mean, blasphemy like this on this Newspeak magazine cover, the second coming. I mean, really and truly. Unprecedented mass communication media opportunities are able to manipulate our emotions. How do you control a nation? You distract them, you deceive them, and you divide them. Modern mass media techniques have allowed unprecedented opportunities for foreign forces to engage in direct communication with any target or enemy, which in this case is us. We're the targeted enemy population. Tell, lie, vision. It's called programming for a reason. Whenever there's a big story in the media, look around for the story they're trying to distract you from. Because you can be sure they are distracting you from the real media. What is really going on that they should be paying attention to, but are not? Muslims attacking Christians in Europe. Jihad, anti-Christian persecution, bombing of churches, storming of churches in the Muslim Middle East, like in Egypt. Islamic jihad on the streets of Europe. Behead those who insult Islam. Freedom, go to hell. That's eloquent. British soldiers burn in hell. This on the 11th of November, mind you, in downtown London. And for cultural enrichment, remember, diversity is our strength. A few suicide bombers blowing up double-decker red buses. A few peaceful, tolerant Muslims assaulting the local police downtown. Burning of the American flag, burning of the Danish flag. You see how Muslims can enrich your country's culture? Throwing of rocks and stones. Can't you just feel the tolerance? Aren't you glad Islam is a peaceful and tolerant religion? Imagine if they were violent. Persecution of the church in the Middle East, like in Iraq, murdering of Christians in Egypt during the so-called Arab Spring, also funded by the USAID, by the way. Genocide in Iraq after it was liberated by the Americans. Bullying and beating up of Christian women in the Middle East, kidnapping them. The oppression of women in the Muslim Middle East. These are some of the news items they don't want you to pay attention to, rather distraction. Something else the news media wanted to be distracted from, the Rotherham abuse scandal. Muslim men were exploiting English girls as young as 11 years old in sex gangs. This was brought before the Child Protection Services, but they weren't interested because it might make them be accused of being racist. So as it finally came out, finally, after more than 25 years of suppression, they found out that, in fact, vast amounts of the British Police, Scotland Yard, Child Protection Services ignored decades of complaints because they didn't want to be thought of as racist, so they just or Islamophobic bigots, and so they just let these Muslims abuse girls, young girls, 13 years old. Vast amounts, hundreds, no, thousands, in the end, hundreds of thousands. In the end, they estimated 1 million girls in England had been abused by these Muslim rape gangs without child protection services, the local police, the local prosecutors, or the Scotland Yard being willing to get involved. Horrific betrayal. And that was just one area, 20,000 victims. They estimate that a full 500,000 girls were abused in Britain without protection because they were white, they were English, they were Christian, and the perpetrators were Muslim and they were Middle Eastern Arabs. Therefore, we're not going to investigate. These are the convicted, not the accused, the convicted from different areas, child rapists, pedophiles, groomers, rape gangs. Grooming gang review was kept secret as the British Home Office claimed releasing the findings was not in the public interest. What I mean is not in our ruling party's interest. It was certainly in the interest of the public to be warned, but wasn't in the interest of the government. Labour never wanted to say a word against the gangs that raped the children because they needed the votes of those very rapists. This young girl, 16 years old, stabbed to death by diversity, which is our strength, remember. This poor little girl also raped, stabbed, murdered by these rapist Muslim gangs in Britain. And the British government, Child Protection Services, police, Scotland Yard would not lift a finger to protect little girls like this. So those are some things I want to distract you from. You don't need to know that stuff. That just gets in the way of the narrative. You know, while they have open borders and they're putting illegal migrants who just fled the country in castles and hotels and things like that, giving them 5-course meals. I don't know if you've actually heard one person suggested we should take all of our old people and put them in prison and take all of the prisoners and put them in old age homes. Because in prison, at least they will get hot showers, they'll get 3 meals a day, there'll be someone watching on them, they'll get medical care all the time and so on. They've got open spaces, they get walks daily, they'll have so much better in prison than they get in old age homes. And the prisoners putting them in an old age home, they're going to get a shower once a week, they're going to not have enough food, they're going to get cold food, and all the rest of it. Actually, rather put the prisoners in old age homes, put the pensioners in the prisons, they'll do better off there. What kind of sick society is like that? Now, just look at some of the fake news, like New York Post, who gets huge amounts of funding from the USAID. This is the kind of news headline sponsored by USAID. It's not even news. This is just like, is this a comic book? Dawn of the Brain Dead. Well, I would have said the brain dead were the people supporting Antifa and BLM. But too close to call, really? It wasn't too close to call. And the fake news stopped the insanity. At last, it's the back of Donald Trump. Vaccine should see new groups get jabs, and so on. And then the amount of anti-Trump headlines, if you've ever tried to read the headlines, it's so disrespectful, so dishonest, so off the wall. These people really, really hate President Donald Trump. They'd never treat any other politician like this. You could have brain-dead characters like Biden and they'd get more respect. You could have these imbeciles like Kamala Harris, this cackling witch who just endlessly was laughing at herself and thinking that she's so eloquent, honestly, and she got more respect. But President Donald Trump, who did more good for America than any president since Ronald Reagan, he was treated like scum. Antichrist. Look who's calling Donald Trump Antichrist, the Pope. I mean, talk about the pot calling the kettle black. And the Pope says, a person who thinks only about building walls and not bridges is not Christian. Well, speaking of which, how many bridges has the Pope built? I don't think there's one bridge in Vatican City, but they've got the tallest walls of any country's borders in the world. And I believe there's not one refugee in the Vatican. So who's the Pope to talk like that? What a shot in the arm for Britain. They're talking about the vaccine. Lorries bring vaccines to Britain. I mean, is this news or is this propaganda? Truth sounds like hate to those who hate the truth. The first casualty in war is the truth. And it is true. There's so much lies, lies, and more lies and damn lies in the media. The amount of garbage. And also these lockdowns are going to avert disaster. Well, the lockdowns were the disaster. You just think of the true scale of UK's COVID-19 death toll. Well, it's more like the true scale of the death toll of the COVID vaccine. People didn't die from the COVID much, but we know people who died of the vaccine. One small jab for man. Where's that come from? One small step for man, one giant step for mankind. When mankind first reached the moon. Now they're trying to equate this like this is equivalent to the lunar Apollo 11 landing on the moon. Incredible. This is not news. Look at this, in a cathedral, having this COVID shot. You know, it's like replace baptism. Come to church to get your vaccination to show you're part of the COVID cult. Wear your mask to show that you're an adherent of this new religion. The vaccine is safe, and we're back on track to freedom. Were you back on track to freedom? People who got the shot still had to wear the mask, still had to social distance, and we're still locked down. So what freedom? Lies, lies, and more lies. Talk about fake news. Don't read all about it. Stop. Use reason. It's all sensationalism. Check your sources. Do your own homework before you believe and react on anything. When it comes to unpleasant truths, there's nobody in the queue. When it comes to comforting lies, lots of people lined up to hear the comforting lies. Truth is truth, even if no one believes it. A lie is a lie, even if everyone believes it. You don't determine truth by majority vote. And the further a society drifts away from the truth, the more it'll hate those who speak the truth. And that's George Orwell's quote from 1984. The most dangerous weapon of all is not a gun or a bomb. The most dangerous weapon is a government-controlled media. You cannot trust any politicians with the molding of the minds of future voters. As my history teacher in Rhodesia reminded us, beware the victor's version. I was very fortunate. In high school, my first history teacher, Mr. Rhys Davies, was a member of Parliament. I remember saying to him, "Sir, how can a member of Parliament be a teacher?" And he says, "We don't get paid for being members of Parliament. We need a real job too." But he said, beware the victor's version. He said, you know the British government is lying about us here in Rhodesia now. Why would you believe anything the British government says about the Second World War, the First World War, or anything else in history for that matter? He said, you need to remember your textbooks are written and printed in Britain. These are British government textbooks that we're using in Rhodesia. You cannot trust the textbooks. Politicians lie. He said, believe me, politicians lie. If you knew the kind of committees that put together the history books, and if you knew their requirements, you wouldn't believe a thing you read in here. Do your own research. Go to the library. Check out source documents. Find out from first-hand sources. Don't trust the textbook. Don't regurgitate to me the textbook. Think outside the box. That's just good advice. That's real education, because education is teaching you how to think critically. Indoctrination is saying, repeat after me, sit down, shut up, open your mind, and I'll just pour in a whole lot of lies and propaganda. We need to stick our neck out. As early as 1930, John Dewey, who is a signatory of the Humanist Manifesto, he observes, we're exposed to the greatest flood of mass suggestion that any people has yet experienced. Now that's in the 1930s. Can you imagine how big the flood is today? Propaganda is to democracies what violence is to dictatorships. So in a dictatorship, do what we tell you or we'll lock you up or we'll break your legs or we'll kill you. In a democracy, they'll get you named and shamed if you don't agree with the narrative and you don't support whatever the present mantra is. Propaganda is the calculated manipulation of public opinion to serve political and ideological interests, and it's pervasive. Now, the best way to learn about this is for us to go to some of the examples in history. What lies behind us and what lies before us are small matters compared to what lies right to our faces. What is lying straight to your face? We are also exposed not only to political propaganda, but to commercial propaganda. Remember, your life cannot be complete without this product or this service. You must buy this and then all your problems will be solved. You know, you'll be so much happier if you just buy this product. And whatever you've got is out of date. You need the new, revised, standard, deluxe, greatest edition, whatever it is. Marketing and advertising is also propaganda, and we'll show you the history. So today, you get propagandists like Richard Dawkins hiring buses to put adverts on like, there's probably no God, now stop worrying and enjoy your life. Well, two can play at that game. The Christians put up another marketing device. The fool has said in his heart, there's no God. there definitely is a God, so join the Christian party and enjoy your life. So that was the counter to Richard Dawkins' nonsense. Propaganda aims to do other people's thinking for them. Propaganda today has moved into proper agenda. Have you heard that term, proper agenda? Not only controlling what you think, but how you think and what you think about. And propaganda dominates a lot of people's lives without them knowing it. So we really need to look into what we're being taught. Propaganda uses highly selective images, devious and prejudicial language. Look at this First World War ad. The empire needs men. That's the British Empire. And the young lions are Canada, India, Australia, New Zealand, South Africa. So the young lions must enlist now and support the old line. So the empire needs men. Yeah, they did. They needed cannon fodder to plow into the Somme and get churned into the mud of Flanders and push up poppies, basically. Your king, your country needs you, Britons. Yeah. This is the same Lord Kitchener who did the concentration camps in South Africa. Well, he was used as the face to recruit people for the British Army in the First World War. Dubious linkages, confusing issues, distorting reality with disinformation is a daily reality. What was the name of the American invasion of Iraq? Operation Enduring Freedom. Did they get freedom? Did it endure? Obviously not. Take up the sword of justice. What justice? The Lusitania sinking, that's been exposed. The Lusitania was packed full of shells, ammunition, explosives. It was endangering the lives of the civilians on the ship by smuggling in weapons to breach a blockade. The British Navy was besieging Germany with a hunger blockade, keeping food out of Germany, and Germans and Austrians were starving. So the Germans countered with a U-boat campaign to stop weapons getting into Britain. Well, blockading weapons is legal, blockading food is against the Geneva Convention. But anyway, take up the sword of justice. There was no justice. This was a rigged own goal. The Lusitania files were sealed for 60 years. I was 15 years old when I got the book, The Lusitania. Absolutely staggering. The details came out. Britain's First Lord Admiralty, Winston Churchill, wanted the Lusitania sunk. The largest ship in the world after the Titanic went down. It was almost the same size as the Titanic. Lusitania was a sister ship to another military ship that was only used for military, but this was still ferrying passengers. He cooked up the idea, we've got to have a ship sunk with a lot of Americans on board. They made sure Germany knew there were hordes of weapons, shells, ammunition. It's now released. The inventory, what was in the ship's cargo, was just massive amounts of explosives and shells and artillery and all the rest of it. And that's why the ship went down with just one torpedo, because it hit midships where the ammunition was in. That's why there were successive other explosions. And in fact, the British already were cracking the German U-boat codes. They knew where the U-boats were. And when they saw the Lusitanians going to miss this wolf pack, they redirected by radio signal, Department of Navy, to steer the Lusitania into a wolf pack where they would meet some subs. Then he saw, no, there's other ships in the area where they might be able to rescue some survivors. We need a lot of people to die here. Redirect them. All these facts came out that, in fact, it was orchestrated by First Lord Admiralty Winston Churchill to make sure the Lusitania got sunk and to make sure that the Lusitania did not have many rescue ships on hand nearby to maximize the amount of casualties, to try and get America into the war. Take up the sword of justice. George Orwell wrote, in a time of universal deceit, telling the truth becomes a revolutionary act. They call us counter-revolutionaries, but actually we who oppose communism are the revolutionaries in a sense, because we're trying to tell the truth. Karl Marx declared, the first battlefield is the rewriting of history. And that's why we've gotten involved a lot in history and writing history books and giving history presentations, because it is the first battlefield. If people have a distorted idea of history, they can be manipulated. The best way of controlling the future is to control the past, in other words, rewrite history, so you can manipulate people in the present to bring about the future you want. Vladimir Lenin, in his book, What is to be Done, published in 1902, he defined propaganda as the use of historical and scientific arguments to indoctrinate the educated and intelligent masses, and agitation is described well in its use of slogans, stories, selected half-truths to exploit the grievances of the uneducated and the ignorant masses. So you've got the educated masses and you've got the uneducated masses. We use propaganda for the educated masses, we use agitation for the uneducated masses. And by the way, do you know Vladimir Lenin owned 23 Rolls Royces, including those set out specifically for Snow? So much for the communists. Deceit is justified, they teach. Every unit of the Communist Party was to have an agit-prop section. Agitation propaganda. Deceit in propaganda is justified because the end justifies the means. You can't make an omelette without breaking eggs. You can't win a war without lots of lies and deception. As Vladimir Lenin regularly said, treaties are like pie crusts. They're made to be broken. To tell the truth is a petty bourgeois habit. But to lie, and to lie convincingly, is a sign of superior intelligence. So how can you negotiate with people who think lying is an art form to be perfected? The aim of propaganda is to rally people behind a cause. If this requires exaggerating, misrepresenting, even lying about the issues in order to gain that support, the end justifies the means. So lying and manipulation, exaggeration is all fine. So the tactics of propaganda, the common tactics is ignore the historic context. Everything has a context, ignore the context, that's irrelevant. Use selective stories. So you don't give the wide-angle lens of what's the big picture, you give the zoom lens. You just zoom in on some aspect that you can blow out of proportion, make that representative, and ignore the real context. So utilizing a broad or narrow source of experts who toe the party line. Demonize the enemy, use the selective narrow focus. Use the zoom lens, not the wide-angle lens of context. If you want to give an accurate picture and perspective, use the wide-angle lens. That's what's happening in general. If you want to distort things, you just use the zoom lens. So just take, for example, October the 7th, Hamas attacks Israel, murders a lot of civilians. They've got body cam footage. They show civilians being killed, babies being killed. They show atrocities, and they broadcast it. They want people to. What are they trying to do? They're wanting to create a reaction. They take hostages. They film themselves taking hostages. They bring them back to Gaza. What do they want? They want the Israeli Defense Force to rise up and to invade Gaza. They want a big reaction because that's when you take hostages, you tell the other side to come back after them. So that's the context. Now ignore the context. Look what Israel's doing to poor Gaza. Look what's going on. Look how they're bombing them. Look how they're invading. Yes, but it's a context. I mean, just think, for example, how many times does this happen, you know? He hit me. Yeah, but you hit me first. And they completely ignore the context. So the fact is, you hit me. Yes, but what did you do to provoke it? No, well, but that's not the point. Actually, it is the point. You want to know the context. And these people who talk, you know, apartheid, 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 but they ignore the context. The whole of Southern Africa was one big war zone, revolutions. You had communist revolutionaries taking over Angola, feeding civilians through a chainsaw, buzzsaw in a sawmill. You had Mozambique, Frelimo, first act, decapitating a Catholic minister, sticking his head on the altar up in Zambezi province in Mozambique. You've got missionaries being slaughtered in Zimbabwe. You've got atrocities taking place throughout the whole of Southern Africa, Swapo planting landmines, cutting off the ears of chiefs, making their wives cook and eat their ears and their lips, all kinds of atrocities taking place. That's the context. Well, what do they want? They want reaction. You know, thesis, antithesis, synthesis, the communist dialectic. They have an action, they want a reaction. And that is meant to lead to the result they want at the end. And so, what does South Africa do? South Africa's got massacres. I mean, what happened with the Sharpeville massacre? Do you know what, anyone heard of Cato Manor? Cato Manor happened before the Sharpeville massacre. So, Cato Manor, a group of PAC thugs stormed Cato Manor police station, cooked and ate the policeman, massacred the policeman in Cato Manor. Then the police station, and every policeman in the country knows about this, now the police station is Sharpeville surrounded. A mob of well-armed people, and we've got the picture, these huge piles of weapons, rifles, spears, canal carriers, all sorts of things, axes, which was confiscated from the crowd. The crowd at Sharpeville were, of course, nervous, super nervous. They're surrounded, they're outnumbered. The fence is being shaken, the fence is trampled down, and police reacted, open fire. Sharpeville massacre. So ignore the context. Who cares about Kate Manor? Who cares about the whole make South Africa governable? The idea of provocation. Same thing with Hamas on the 7th of October. You have a provocation and you want to provoke a reaction. The reaction then is what you focus on. You ignore the historic context. You use selective stories. You make the exceptional representative. So you focus on every single time the Israeli Defense Force has attacked a terrorist base. It's not a terrorist base, it was a refugee camp. And they pick on one poor innocent soul who got caught up in the crossfire, who sometimes wasn't that innocent, but that's the story. And the South African police never shot murderous rioters. They shot some poor guy who's just on the way to the shop to buy milk for his family. You know, they focus on some exception, which is probably a lie anyway. But that's the way the terrorists work. You've got to focus on some exceptional thing. You don't want to see the big picture. So you don't even want the facts, because the facts would ruin a good story. And you utilize a very narrow source of experts, those who toe the party line. You've heard of The View in America? Well, their view is totally from the left. And so this is in Russian, the people shall govern. The people must govern means the party will govern. I don't know if you've heard of the whole Freedom Charter laws. The people shall govern. So I was at one community and I said, well, I'm a person too. I was told, no, you're not. I'm not a person? No. And it turned out you've got to be a Communist Party member to be a person. The people shall govern means the Communist Party will govern. You are not a person. Unless you're a member of the Communist Party, you're not a person. And you've got to understand how this works. And when they say the party will rule, it means the Politburo will rule. And when you say the Politburo will rule, what really means is the dictator or Stalin will rule, the chairman will rule. So it goes from the people to the party to the Politburo to actually the dictator. And here's the Marx Brothers. You've got going from left to right, Joseph Stalin, Vladimir Lenin, Leon Trotsky. And Trotsky, of course, was the hero of the revolution. Here's the head of the Red Army. Levi Bronstein. Does anyone know where Levi Bronstein or Leon Trotsky was when the Bolshevik Revolution occurred? He was actually in New York, in the Bronx. And he was then given masses of money. We're talking about millions and millions of dollars, much of it in gold. And he was sent by Canada to St. Petersburg to get into Russia in order to launch the Red Army. And he had massive money from Wall Street. There's a book written out by Professor Anthony Sutton, Wall Street and the Bankrolling of the Bolshevik Revolution. We've got in our library downstairs. Levi Bronstein, or Leo Trotsky, was able to equip all the KGB with leather jackets, the latest in machine guns, armored trains, driving Rolls Royces, you name it. They were well bankrolled by the Wall Street. Wall Street bankrolled the Bolshevik Revolution, partly because they hated the state bank in Russia, which didn't use usury like the Rothschild banks. It wasn't under Wall Street, but they obviously thought they could manipulate and use the communists for their own ends too. And so the capitalists funded the Bolshevik Revolution. Fact. You've got to demonize the enemy, often with fictitious stories. I mean, this kind of crass garbage. Wounded prisoner, our soldier cries for water. The German nursing sister pours the water on the ground before his eyes. There's no woman in Britain who would do it. There's no woman in Germany who would do it either, mind you. There's no woman in Britain who will forget it. This is totally fictitious, just cooked up in the fevered imaginations of the propaganda department in Britain. And it's this sort of thing. You demonize the enemy. And you see this most clearly in, well, I'll give other examples with some American movies. It's not enough to dislike the enemy, you've got to demonize them, you've got to hate them pathologically. The German philosopher George Hegel in 1821 wrote The Philosophy of Right, and he explained how in democracies the public is manipulated and persuaded by hidden persuaders and by hidden manipulators. The French author Anatole France wrote, democracy is run by an unseen engineer. if you've seen the Wizard of Oz, the wizard actually is behind the screen. He's not that impressive in real life, but he's manipulating the whole scene. So Mark Twain in 1916 described the rise of propaganda in America. Next, the statesman will invent cheap lies, putting the blame upon the nation that is attacked. And every man will be glad of those conscience-soothing falsities, and will diligently study them and refuse to examine any refutations of them. And thus he will by and by convince himself that the war is just. And he will thank God for the better sleep he enjoys after this process of grotesque self-deception. If you don't come to democracy, democracy will come to you. There's no better way to persuade people to want to be democratic than to get a B-52 bomber to come and offload a couple of tons of incendiary bombs over you. Democracy is going to come soon to a neighborhood near you, especially if you've got oil in your country or any other precious minerals. Democracy coming to a neighborhood near you. President Woodrow Wilson of the United States, by executive order, created the Committee on Public Information, or CPI, in association with the Military Intelligence Bureau. The CPI was America's propaganda office. The CPI defined propaganda as the systematic, widespread dissemination or promotion of particular ideas, doctrines, or practices meant to further a particular cause or agenda and weaken that of another. It is a systematic effort to manipulate attitudes, beliefs, and actions by the use of symbols. And so the Committee on Public Information was run by Edward Bernays, a nephew of Sigmund Freud. Sigmund Freud, should remind you, he is this sex-obsessed pervert based in Vienna, Austria, who was convinced that people could be psychoanalyzed and all that, but how you could manipulate people's emotions. Now, Bernays was a theatrical publicist employed by George Creel as a propagandist for the Committee on Public Information. And George Freud had a very perverse mind, and unfortunately he's had a very big influence on psychology to the detriment of people, civilizations and its discoveries. Bernays based his methodology on the social science researches of the French psychologist Gustave Le Bon, who wrote The Psychology of the Crowd, and on Sigmund Freud's book of 1922, Group Psychology and Analysis of the Ego. People are selfish, how you can manipulate the selfishness. As well as the research of the Russian experimental psychologist Ivan Pavlov, as published in his book Conditioned Reflexes, published in 1926. So you've heard of Pavlov and the dog. So he explored the animal machine because people are basically animals, as he said. You put a food bowl in front of a dog, he'll salivate in anticipation. And then before conditioning, you ring a bell, no salivation. But if you ring a bell every time you feed him food, he'll start to have the conditioned response of salivating when he hears the bell and then sees the food. After a while, you can just ring the bell and he'll salivate in anticipation of the food, even though no food's coming to him now. So Pavlovian response they speak about. Conditioned reflexes. You can be conditioned in different ways. And they found ways of being able to condition people to do things they wouldn't want to do. Pavlov, that name rings a bell. Bernays based much of his methodology upon the works of Walter Lippmann, who wrote about controlling and managing public opinion. His ideas were later published in Public Opinion and The Phantom Public. You keep hearing, I mean, we heard this how much in South Africa in the 1980s? Public opinion. Public opinion won't tolerate this, and all people agree, or all right-thinking people agree, or all scientists agree, or this sort of thing. And you were continually told what the people want and what the people think. And there's no people that all think one thing. There's lots of individuals who have different thoughts in different groups, mind you. But Walter Lippmann was a member of the United States military intelligence during the First World War. He believed people are irrational and people act chaotically. Because people are unable to independently make rational choices, they need to be guided by a specialized class of enlightened elites. Guilt manipulation in this case. Lippmann described people as simple-minded and sheep-like, incapable of formulating or organizing their ideas, their interests, or their wishes. Therefore, the educated elites, including himself, of course, could lead and educate the masses. As Lippmann put it, making of one general will out of a multitude of general wishes. The public must be regimented. So he believed in the public philosophy. the challenges facing democratic societies analyzed by America's leading political thinker. And so Walter Lippmann also wrote about US foreign policy, the shield of the republic, which is what US AID's grown out of. And Walter Lippmann wrote about the American century. The 19th century is the British century, the 20th century is the American century. So we take over everything. And so he was forecasting through propaganda how to get the Americans to be open to an American-dominated world in the 20th century. In 1927, Harold Laswell, a professor of political science in the University of Chicago, analyzed the propaganda techniques employed by the Allies in the First World War. A new and subtle instrument must weld thousands, even millions of human beings into one amalgamated mass of hate and war and hope through propaganda. It is the new dynamic of society. The fact remains that propaganda is one of the most powerful instrumentalities of the modern world. Propaganda is a reflex to the immensity, the irrationality, the woefulness of the modern world. And so Laswell explained that to mobilize the hatred of the people against the enemy, you need to represent the opposing nation as a menacing, murderous aggressor, and represent the opposing nation as satanic, that they violate all moral standards. And you've got to, now, for example, in the First World War, they decided to depict the Germans as the Hun. But the Huns were not Germans. Germans fought the Huns and kept the Huns out of Europe. Hungary is the nation that grew out of the Huns. The Huns were, until the Huns people invading, the people who stopped them were the Saxons of Germany. But forget history, forget logic, let's call the Germans the Huns. And this will identify 4 major objectives of propaganda. You need to mobilize hatred against the enemy, who must be dehumanized, portrayed as barbaric, brutal, cruel, uncivilized. We need to preserve the friendship of our allies. We need to preserve the friendship and, if possible, to procure the cooperation of the neutrals. And we need to demoralize the enemy. So this is called PSYOPs, psychological warfare, psychological operations. You have PSYOPs own forces, you have PSYOPs local population, you have PSYOPs enemy forces. To mobilize hatred against the enemy, you must dehumanize the enemy, portray them as barbaric, brutal, cruel, and uncivilized. And so they would do this with simple cartoons at first, but got more sophisticated. Probably the most sophisticated demonizing of the enemy I've ever seen is in The Patriot, which is a bit of a, it's quite a well-made film, but it demonizes the British in a way that is just off the charts. The Colonel depicted here is depicted as so evil that you don't just hate him. I mean, you just can't wait to cheer when he gets ripped to pieces. So, I mean, I remember even my beloved little daughter giving out a whoop of excitement when he finally got killed. I mean, you all just hate this guy. I mean, he kills the young son of the hero. He orders burnt down a church with the congregation, including the beloved wife of one of the heroes in the film. Now, it so happens the British never burnt down a church in America with civilians in it. I once met a professor with a doctorate in history on the American Revolutionary War. And we were going around a battle site, and I said to him, can I ask you a question? Did that ever happen in the Revolutionary War that British forces burned American civilians in a church? And he started out, he said, no, well, yes, let me explain. He said, no, the American revolutionaries never did it. The British troops never did that to revolutionaries, but revolutionary Americans did burn to death a congregation of loyalists, Americans who supported the crown. That did happen the other way around. But no regular forces, no British troops ever burned a congregation of people. I would say no Christian forces from any Christian country could ever have done it. The Soviet Union did that. Communist Chinese did that. ZANU-PF terrorists in Zimbabwe did that. But to depict a beloved member of the cast, the wife of this hero, amongst a whole lot of other civilians, burned to death in this building. Of course, I mean, everyone in the audience hates this guy. So you've demonized the enemy so much. I mean, it's the British in general, and it's this particular colonel in particular who's got to get destroyed in the most violent way possible. So that's what good propaganda is. You demonize the enemy. And the Americans are darn good at demonizing the enemies. Think what did it to Saddam Hussein. Or to preserve the friendship of allies. So look at this, the Red Army. The Red Army's fight is your fight. The Red Army is your friend. Tell it to the people on the ground who experience the Red Army. Number 3, want to preserve the friendship and, if possible, to procure the cooperation of neutrals, which at the beginning of the war included the United States. Get the neutrals in on your side and so on. And you want to demoralize the enemy. So just take propaganda. Here's Pravda. That's Pravda in Russian. Pravda means truth. Izvestia means news. There were 2 newspapers in the Soviet Union. Izvestia, which means news, and Pravda, which means truth. And our local friends in Russia say, there's nothing true in Pravda, there's nothing new in Izvestia. And that's good. You turn their propaganda against them. This was the front cover of Pravda at one point. Thank you, Comrade Stalin, for my happy childhood. Now, this girl should have had a happy childhood. Her father and mother were high up in the Politburo in the Soviet Union. She is a privileged elite of the Soviet Union. But within a year of this picture being taken, her father had been shot by order of Comrade Stalin. Her mother died in a labor work camp because they fell out of favor of the Soviet Union. So that's the poster child of the Soviet Union. Thank you, Comrade Stalin, for my happy childhood. Now, when I was in the military, I was infantry, but when I got my call-ups, I got moved into intelligence at one point. And my job was COMOPS enemy forces, break down the morale of the enemy. And so we would find out factoids like this and make it known to the enemy to break down their morale. And that's important because the enemy is trying to break down your people's morale. You need to break down their morale. So sometimes you do what we call counter-graffiti. So the ANC puts out a sign, working together we can do so much more. And then counter-graffiti comes and adds crime. We used to do this with graffiti that have on bridges and so on. That have the ECC end conscription campaign. And we turned into every coward's choice. UDF, they put that up one night, next night we're going to return to Uni Royal, Dunlop and Firestone. Because the necklace murders at that time. And so they would put out Desmond Tutu adverts for big events, and we'd get stickers printed, cancelled due to lack of support, and go and put that all over. And so you do counter graffiti, you break down the morale of the others. They set up, they one night put all the way along this road, Milner Road, posters, every lamppost, ANC post and so on. Well, that night we came along, I was on my motorbike, and there's a person behind the bucky, and we took every post down. I cut them down, and then the next person behind me threw them in the back of the bucky. And that meant next day, they'd done all this work, next day they come, they're gone, not even lying at the bottom. All that hard work undermined. I mean, that breaks down the morale of people. So, counter-graffiti, to moralize the enemy. Remember, I'd rather offend someone into heaven than flatter somebody into hell. The truth might be unpopular, but it's better to be slapped with the truth than kissed with a lie. That's a Russian proverb. So, before being elected as a candidate for peace in the US presidential elections in 1916, Woodrow Wilson warned, lead this people into war. They will forget there ever was such a thing as tolerance. To fight, you must be brutal and ruthless. And the spirit of ruthless brutality will enter into the very fiber of the national life, infecting the Congress, the courts, the policeman on the beat, the man in the street. So in January of 1916, Woodrow Wilson stated, this is the government of the people, and this people is not going to choose war. Well, in fact, he invaded Haiti, established a dictatorship. He invaded Dominican Republic, installed a dictatorship the next year. So very interesting that he would be going into the First World War because he's concerned about democracy and invasion, because he did invasions and dictatorships. Well, Woodrow Wilson wins, and next thing, after being elected on the slogan, he has kept us out of the war, Woodrow Wilson established the Committee on Public Information. Now, 80% of Americans opposed war and were isolationist when he got elected. But he got the Committee of Public Information to turn the public consciousness from isolationism to interventionism. And he was so effective, he got a situation where if anyone believed that America's entry into the war in Europe was a mistake, he was branded as a traitor. So the majority opinion democratically just before the election was now turned into treason. More than 8 million German Americans lived in America. Many were sympathetic to the cause of their homeland. 1/3 of Americans were immigrants. Most Americans were not connected to the European conflict by blood or investment and were not interested in waging war overseas. So the Committee on Public Information developed the most formidable propaganda apparatus in history. This muckraking journalist, George Creel, led the CPI, and with a phenomenal budget. I mean, think USAID today, this is just the history. The CPI recruited from the best in business, the best in media, the best in academia, the best in art world. They had the money, they could give above market value wages, they could literally recruit the best, headhunt and so on. And they blended advertising techniques with a sophisticated understanding of human psychology. This is the first time that a modern government disseminated propaganda on such a large scale. Although propaganda came to be linked with the totalitarian regimes like the Soviet Union and Red China, it's a fact of history. Propaganda first emerged in a democratic state. Although as a journalist, George Creel had been an unspoken critic of censorship before, his CPI immediately took steps to limit conflicting information, to shut up any conflicting opinions. With the Espionage Act and the Sedition Act, voluntary guidelines were enforced on the news media to ensure that the mass media in the United States was flooded with pro-war material and pro-war perspectives, even though a proven 80% of the population before 1916 opposed intervention in Europe's wars. On any given week, more than 20,000 newspaper columns were filled with material gleaned from CPI press releases. In other words, propaganda. The CPI created a division of syndicated features. They recruited the help of leading novelists, short story writers, essayists, to present the pro-war position in a popular, digestible format, reaching 12 million readers a month. Now, this is why they need a big budget. And this explains what's been going on with USAID now. The Division of Pictorial Publicity had at its disposal the most talented advertising illustrators, cartoonists of the time, and they produced some amazing work. Powerful posters painted in patriotic colors presented compelling images throughout the country. The poster propaganda motivated millions to enlist in the Army and Navy. Even here you can see red, white, and blue for the Navy. And having their flag colors, red, white, and blue, the positive is put in the best colors, negative and negative colors. Manipulation, getting boys and girls to give their quarters, their pocket money, to buy war savings stamps. I mean, all kinds of nonsense like that. The division of films ensured that war was promoted in the cinema. The Hollywood film industry wholeheartedly supported the war effort, with movie titles like The Kaiser, The Beast of Berlin, The Wolves of Culture, To Hell with the Kaiser. I mean, that's subtle. Pershing's Crusaders. And the cause of the Allies was creatively published in every available communication channel, including pulpits. They were able to bribe and buy pastors to promote and preach up war and interventionism. Laswell pointed out, propaganda wins wars. With words, with pictures, with songs, with parades, many similar devices, by the manipulation of collective attitudes. The head of the Viet Cong in Vietnam said, we didn't win the war against the Americans in the jungle. We won the war on the university campuses and on newspaper headlines and the television screens in the United States. You can win war with propaganda. I mean, we can say too in South Africa, the ANC lost every single battle and skirmish on the ground, in the bush. But they won in the propaganda field. They lost the fighting war, they won the propaganda war. And that's the way it often works. CPI propaganda showed the way for future propaganda agencies by appealing to the heart, not the mind. Emotional agitation and skillful manipulation made use of manufactured atrocity stories, simplistic slogans like, make the world safe for democracy. Instead of, let's wage war on our economic competitors, make the world safe for democracy. Doesn't it sound so much nicer? Operation Iraqi Freedom, Operation Enduring Freedom. I mean, you know, these are far more motivational when you come to words like that. Even they call themselves pro-choice, not pro-abortion, pro-choice. Words matter. And today, in the name of democracy, all kinds of infiltrations can be brought in like the Trojan horse. That's a Trojan horse. They claim in the name of democracy, but then what is inside LGBTQ and all kinds of other perversions, transgender surgery? They're going to bring in a Trojan horse of other things. Will Irwin, a member of the CPI, wrote after the war, "We never told the whole truth, not by any means." They quoted a military intelligence officer who declared, "You can't tell them the truth." Victories were routinely manufactured by military authorities in America. They had to, because they weren't getting that many. So defeats were suppressed, dishonesty was encouraged. And if you want to see lies, lies, and more lies, just think of what you've heard about the Ukraine war. Yeah, Ukraine's winning. I mean, even in the beginning, there was this ghost of Kiev, which is totally fictional, that they were shooting down Russian planes and this, that, the other. Then there's this brave island that was being challenged by the Russian Navy and, go to hell, and they were fought to the end, and total manufactured garbage. Putin's worried, Putin's dying, Putin's sick, Putin's unpopular, Putin's super unpopular, Putin's about to be replaced by his army, there's about to be a revolution there. Russian army is losing lots and lots. Why did anyone ever have to send any help to Ukraine? All the spectacular things Ukraine was doing, according to the propaganda, they were winning the war from day one. And how did Russia gain control over so much of Ukraine? Because they were losing all the time. They shouldn't have any soldiers left in the whole of Russia by now, because if you listen to the propaganda, lies, lies, more lies. But you've got to send more aid to Ukraine, even though Ukraine's winning so spectacularly well, and Russia's got no chance whatsoever. But no, you just hear lies, lies, and more lies. The same sort of lies they would have been telling during the Second World War about Germany, they're now telling about Russia. Same lies they're told against Rhodesia, against South Africa, Southwest Africa. They're just over and over. They'll manufacture victories for themselves. They'll manufacture defeats for the other side. They'll manufacture scandals of the other leadership. And the analyst attributed the failure of German propaganda in America to the fact that the Germans emphasized logic over passion. As Count von Bernstorff observed, the outstanding characteristic of the average American is rather a great, though superficial, sentimentality. And Laswell observed, so great are the psychological resistances to war in modern nations that every war must appear to be a war of defense against a menacing, murderous aggressor. There must be no ambiguity about who the public is to hate. So depict the most civilized, cultured nation in Europe as a bestial guerrilla who's out of his mind, aggressive, charging, threatening you, trampling on America, and enlisting the army, destroy this mad brute. Well, that's not true. That's not rational, but that's the way propaganda works. And Bernays openly admitted he and his colleagues used made-up stories to provoke the hate and fear necessary to raise the war bonds and the recruits for the war. Some of their stories, like finding a bathtub full of eyeballs and children's being killed by the enemy, were just recycled from previous conflicts. And you can see Hollywood does this in the movies as well. They will often just do something that didn't even happen. Even if they say based on a true story, there's some really mean, nasty thing done by one of the enemy to justify why you've got to hate them and justify the war, and why carpet bombing civilians in that country is totally justified because of this, that, and the other. And so effective was the anti-German propaganda in the CPI that Dachshunds had to be renamed. People were stoning to death Dachshunds and German Shepherds. 14 states banned the teaching or speaking of German in their public schools. Mobs assaulted German immigrants from Germany. At least one man, Robert Prager, a German coal miner, was lynched by an angry mob in Illinois. There were Amish youngsters who were imprisoned and even lynched, hung, for refusing to enlist in the army because they were pacifists. They didn't believe in enlisting in any army. The CPI recognized that while emotional appeals and simplistic stereotypes of the enemy could influence many people, the intellectuals and the pacifists needed a different motivation. And so to them, America's military intervention in Europe was described as a campaign to end warfare forever, the war to end all wars, and a warfare to establish the League of Nations, which many idealists thought was actually going to solve problems. To industrialists, the war was modified as a conflict to destroy the competition of German industry. And, that's more pragmatic. The propagandist does not need to ask if it's true. He merely needs to ask, does it work? Pragmatic argument. In the final months of 1918, a war-weary American public voted out the Democrats. They voted them out of the House, the Senate, and the White House. A complete sweep. A red wave. In came the Republicans. The Republican majority in Congress brought the CPI under increasing scrutiny. There was such revulsion. We've just had over 170,000 Americans die for no reason whatsoever. all based on a lie, and the people realized we've been lied to, and there was revulsion. And they brought such heavy laws in to prevent America ever getting involved in a foreign war again. The director of CPI's Foreign Division later reported the history of propaganda in the war would scarcely be worthy of consideration here, except for one fact. The propaganda did not stop with the armistice. No, indeed. The methods invented and tried out in war were too valuable for the users of governments, factions, and special interests. Most Americans came to realize they'd been lied to and they'd been manipulated by deceit, disguised as news. And they sought to pin complete responsibility for America's involvement in the war on the hate-mongering propagandists in the CPI. And this is why Franklin Delano Roosevelt had to engineer this attack on Pearl Harbor to justify America getting over its aversion to interventionism to get them involved in the Second World War, which is why they withheld the information from the base that was about to be attacked, even when they cracked the codes of the Japanese Navy. But as one noted, ultimately their guilt is less important than the questions their activities raised about the role of propaganda in a democratic society. The whole theory of democratic society is rooted in the belief that free citizens could form their own opinions about the issues of the day to decide their collective destiny. But when you start to take millions of tax dollars and use it to propagandize, indoctrinate people, disinformation and so on, well, where's democracy then? And now we see that so many of our free press is actually paid for by a political entity that even is subversive to their own country. How can we trust such a media? Freedom of speech, freedom of opinion, freedom of association, freedom of thought, freedom of religion are fundamental necessities for any democratic process. And this violates if propaganda cuts across these freedoms. Is propaganda compatible with freedom? During the First World War, America's political leaders decided their citizens were not making the correct decisions quickly enough. They're politically incorrect. They're behind the times. So they had to brainwash the people. So they flooded the channels of communication with dishonest messages that were designed to stir up emotions, provoke hatred of their one-time trading partner, Germany. The war did come to an end, but the propaganda did not come to an end. In fact, we still get every year how many films produced rehashing the propaganda of the First and Second World War. More lies, lies, more lies. People are whipped up, and certain people feel so worked up about these things, and it's not even true, and we're far from the events when these things happened. Today, many who espouse the ideals of democracy behave like dictators and propagandists. You're not allowed to have that opinion. The question isn't whether propaganda is compatible with freedom. Propaganda clearly undermines a population's abilities to think clearly and to think critically about world events. Simplistic emotional appeals undermine logic and reason. You just need to study the lies, lies, and more lies told for the war in Iraq in 2003. They've got weapons of mass destruction. Nobody ever found them, but they're producing an atomic bomb. They're about to dump 80,000 liters of anthrax on the world. I mean, the propaganda just never ended. There was no link of Saddam Hussein with the 9/11 terrorist attackers. No link at all. Lots of links to Saudi Arabia, but Saudi Arabia is an American client state, so they get a free pass. But Iraq, we had to take them over. Mind you, they did have a lot of oil, inconveniently. From my Christian perspective, I looked at Iraq and thought, you have 1.3 million Christians in Iraq who are living in basic religious freedom. They have more religious freedom under Saddam Hussein's Iraq than anywhere else in the Middle East except for Assad, Syria. Funny how those two countries got toppled and replaced with anti-Christian dictators. But that's something else. The lies, lies, and more lies whipped Christians up to support the idea of bludgeoning and bombing Iraq. Hundreds of thousands of Iraqi civilians were killed in the bombings. Hundreds of thousands. More than 1 million people in the Middle East died as a result of the wave of attacks and bombs that America launched in the name of Iraqi freedom and enduring freedom. More than 1 million civilians. But they're not worthy victims. You see, worthy victims are our people. Unworthy victims are their people. It doesn't matter if they died because they ruled by a dictator, and civilians' lives are not worth as much as they live under dictatorship and so on. So there's all kinds of garbage. You can see it's simplistic emotional appeals. Students of propaganda noticed while the CPI was the largest propaganda operation to that date, it wasn't actually the first such deception operation in American history. Shortly after the end of the American Civil War, or the war between the states, the journalist Colborne Adams wrote, "The future historian of the late war will have a very difficult task to perform, to sift the truth from the falsehood as it appears in official records." Even in official records, we're so riddled with propaganda lies and distortions, we're going to have trouble writing the history. Now, two prominent newspapermen took the credit for leading America into the Spanish-American War of 1898. William Randolph Hearst and Joseph Pulitzer. You've heard the Pulitzer Prize. Well, this is the man it's named after. Those two editorially campaigned and clamored for American military intervention against Spain. Through disinformation and media manipulation, these newspaper tycoons induced the United States to wage an unnecessary war against Spain. They used sensational, inflammatory propagandist articles, editorials in Pulitzer's World and Hearst Journal, and has succeeded in inciting such a war hysteria and a public enthusiasm throughout America for war with Spain. And a key part of it was blowing up the Maine. So an American battleship goes into Havana Harbor, and it blows up. And the evidence is it blew up from inside. It was probably an own goal. It's recognized today as a false flag. America blew up their own ship, killing their own men to justify a war with Spain. There was no reason for Spain to blow up an American battleship in their own harbor. And this is almost certainly an own goal. But Rudolf Hearst sent the artist Frederick Remington and another journal correspondent to report on the war in Cuba. Remington reported, "Everything is quiet. There's no trouble here. There will be no war. I wish to return." Hearst sent the following telegram: "Please remain. You finish the pictures, I'll finish the war." Pulitzer and Hearst published inaccurate coverage, rumor, subterfuge, hearsay, outright fictitious reports to drum up a feverish public demand for war. On the 15th of February 1898, the US battleship Maine blew up in the Havana Harbor. The cause of the explosion was never officially determined, but the immediate media reaction was to blame Spain. And Pulitzer and Hearst clamored for war with titles like Maine explosion, caused by bomb or torpedo. I mean, there's other options aside from that, but torpedo and bomb is to come from outside. But what about an explosive device planted inside? But their journal ran the headline, "How do you like the journal's war?" The Americans happened to have their Navy pre-positioned at key points to seize Spanish territories across the Pacific, like in the Philippines, and absolutely pre-organized. War was put together by Pulitzer and Hearst. Tweedledum, Tweedledee. After World War I, Edward Bernays pioneered public relations, the first two words of propaganda. And so he called it PR, which later they found, what does PR stand for? Well, it's meant to be short for propaganda, but you can't use that word in business. So they came up with the idea of public relations, PR. And he became known as the father of spin. Now, his book here has got a fan and bananas and a woman smoking a cigarette, because those are three of his great success stories. He persuaded people everyone needed a fan, persuaded people how healthy it was to eat bananas, and because they were taking more and more banana republics over in the Caribbean, so they needed people to start eating bananas, and to persuade women to smoke. And he was running intelligent manipulation. As the PR consultant for the American Tobacco Company, he campaigned to convince American women they can smoke Lucky Strike cigarettes, the torches of freedom, to emancipate themselves. There was such a social stigma, decent women didn't smoke, and it was considered a great disgrace. And he said, "I can double your sales." How can you double our sales? Get women to smoke. Women aren't going to smoke. Yes, they are. Give me the budget, I'll do it. He hired models, fashion models, had them go out in the Easter parade, smoking in public, he hired the photographers, took glamorous pictures, called them the torches of freedom, and before you know it, they appealed to the average woman. How do you like these subtle adverts? Light a Lucky, and you'll never miss those sweets that make you fat. How's that for subtle advertising? An ancient prejudice removed. American intelligence. So yes, we used to dress like that for the beach. Now we dress like that for the beach. And here's another prejudice. Women don't smoke. Well, women can smoke. An ancient prejudice has been removed. 20,679 physicians. I bet they sucked that number out of their thumb. say Lucky's are less illustrating. It's toasted. It's like a doctor's recommending you should smoke. My mom said when she started to smoke as a nurse, it was because doctors were being used as advertising for it. That it's healthy to smoke. It's good protection for your lungs. It keeps you healthy. Doctors were used to advertise smoking, just like doctors were used to advertise the COVID vaccination. So you get prostitutes in journalism, you get doctors who like that as well. You need this throat protection. If you're on radio, you need to smoke to protect your lungs, right? Real love is getting cancer together. Yeah, forever and forever. Well, actually, it won't be that long. Propaganda. See, the target is on a woman smoking. Propaganda, Edward Bernays was the father of public relations and propaganda. In fact, Joseph Goebbels studied Bernays to base his propaganda department in the Second World War on it. Because Edward Bernays, he's like the gold standard of propaganda. Today, American businesses spend trillions of dollars on marketing, which is another word for propaganda, but it's commercial propaganda. PR firms employ over 150,000 workers just in the United States. Media control is one of the textbooks on this too. And so billboards, that's actually kind of funny. This is during the Depression, and people are queuing up under billboards saying the world's highest standard of living. It's no way like the American way. So this ties in now with the Gramsci strategy. The Italian Communist Party leader, Antonio Gramsci, was a co-founder of the Italian Communist Party, part of the Frankfurt School. He declared to capture the Christian West, you've got to Marxize the inner man. Lenin got lucky. We're not likely to get so lucky. The correlation of force that brought about the collapse of the Russian Empire and the rise of the Bolsheviks isn't going to happen in the West. The West is too Christian. We need to Marxize the inner man. Get Christians to think of every problem without reference to the Bible or Christ, but we've got to turn the Christian mind to a non-Christian mind and then into an anti-Christian mind. This will take at least 2 generations. We've got to get individuals to think about life's problems without reference to Christianity or the laws of God. We need a quiet revolution. Everything must be done in the name of man's dignity and man's rights, in the name of his autonomy and freedom from outside restraint, from the claims and restraints of Christianity above all. And that's the Gramsci strategy, the termite strategy. Capture the culture, which of course is the slogan not only of the communists, the Frankfurt School, but also people like Richard Dawkins. The tactics of propaganda have been analyzed, and these are the key tactics used. Decontextualize the violence. Focus on the irrational without looking at the reasons. Dualism. Reduce the number of parties in the conflict to 2. There's normally more involved, but turn to 2, good and the bad. Like in the Second World War, the way it was portrayed in Hollywood is England is fighting Germany. And according to the English media, England won the war, according to American propaganda, America won the war. But what about the Soviet Union? In fact, the Second World War was primarily between German nationalism and the Soviet communism. 90% of all German soldiers fell on the Eastern Front. The Eastern Front was the main, mincemeat mill in which most of everything went. Now, if the Allies had landed on Normandy beach and faced the entire German army, they wouldn't have had a chance. They wouldn't have got off the beach. But the German army was on the Eastern Front fighting Russia. And so what the Americans faced on Omaha Beach was not Germans. They were facing Czechs and Russians fighting in the German army. And yes, they were wearing German uniforms, but this idea that the German army was at Normandy, no, they were not. Most of the Germans were in the Eastern Front, but what they had on the Western Front were mostly foreign volunteers. But, why mess up that? In the longest day, they're not going to depict that. They depicted only Germans on the German front, and the Allies were winning the war at the Battle of Normandy. Of course, the British and Americans had less than 5% of German casualties came from the Western Front from the Allies. And most of those were prisoners being murdered after the war, actually. So ignore the fact that you've got a worse ally than even your enemy, like the Soviet Union. Just reduce it to dualism. It's just the good and the bad, us and them. Manichaeism. One side is good and the other side is evil. In fact, they're demonic. And Armageddon. The violence is inevitable. there are no alternatives. No, there couldn't be a negotiated peace, there couldn't be a settlement, there couldn't be a ceasefire. There's no alternative to, this is like predestined, predicted, it's in prophecy in the Bible virtually. We are facing Armageddon. Confusion. Focus only on the conflict area, not on the forces and factors that influence the violence. So, more confused to make it the better. Never explain why there are acts of revenge and spirals of violence. What was the German rocket called in the Second World War? There was the V1 and the V2. What does the V stand for? Vengeance. Vengeance 1, Vengeance 2. Why? Because the Allies were carpet bombing German cities, and because of the Lancaster bombers, which could take 17 tons apiece. These big 4-engine bombers are dropping tons and tons of bombs on German cities. The Germans designed the rockets as the vengeance for the bombing of cities in Germany. So don't explain what V stands for. You know, just they do bad things. Are they reacting to anything? Of course not. There's no context. There's no reason. Number 7, failure to explore the causes of the escalation. Failure to explore the impact of the media coverage itself. For example, why are Allied ships being sunk? Well, because the Royal Navy is enforcing a hunger blockade of Germany, preventing even food to come in, which is a breach of the Geneva Convention, but don't worry about that. So they're doing a counter blockade, but they're using submarines because they don't have a navy to combat the Royal Navy, so they're using subs. But do you know that both Britain and America had more submarines than Germany? Yet the way I was brought up with the films was Germany was not being gentlemanly using submarines. Well, as it so happens, the British and Americans had vastly more submarines than Germany did. And their orders of encountering the Japanese Navy, of sinking ships, was not quite as gentlemanly. But anyway, that's something else. Failure to explore the goals of outside intervention, especially the big powers and the bankers. America's getting involved in Europe's war just for altruistic motives. It's not that they're planning to build an economic empire or anything like that. Failure to explore peace proposals and offer images of peaceful outcomes, because no, peace is not an option. You're a traitor if you consider peace. Do you know that over 5,000 British leaders were imprisoned without trial, detained without trial in the Second World War by Winston Churchill, including members of Parliament? The father of my member of Parliament from Rhodesia, Mr. Rhys Davies, was detained without trial throughout the Second World War. Lords, admirals, generals, members of Parliament, members of the House of Lords, detained without trial. Why? Because they advocated a peaceful resolution. Let's accept the peace offer and things like this. Or what Rudolf Hess was offering. Peace on the West, we'll return back to pre-1939 boundaries, just give us a free hand in the East. And don't support Russia, lift the blockade. I mean, no territorial demands whatsoever. And there were people in the royal family even who supported it, locked up or assassinated in the case of one of the royals, but that's another story. Confusing a ceasefire negotiations with actual peace. Is there a peace treaty in the Middle East right now? No, it's a ceasefire. There's no peace actually. Hamas has not accepted peace. There is no peace. The war is just suspended for a moment for exchange of hostages and relief of relief aid coming through civilians and so on. So sometimes people think a ceasefire is a peace treaty, but it's not. And you must omit reconciliation as a viable option. The propagandist wants you to want war. You've got to hate the enemy. You've got to destroy the enemy. So decontextualize the violence, focus on the irrational, don't look at the reasons. Dualism. There's only two sides, the good and the bad. But who's this guy over here? Isn't it Joseph Stalin with Franklin Delano Roosevelt and Churchill? I mean, they're not all exactly the same, are they? Manichaeism. One side is good, the other side is evil. And here, the Japanese are depicted as some kind of demonic octopus sort of thing. Dehumanize them. Armageddon. Violence is inevitable. There are no alternatives. The sun is rising in the west. Enlist. Confusion. Focus on the conflict area, not on the factors and forces influencing the violence. Never explain why there are acts of revenge and spirals of violence. Failure to explore the cause of the escalation, the impact of media coverage itself. Yeah, there was a time when Umkhonto we came alongside our oil refinery here in Milnerton, shot mortars and RPG rockets into trying to set the whole thing ablaze. If that had taken up, can you imagine how much destruction would have been caused to the areas around? At one point, Umkhonto we in 1981 tried to blow up our nuclear power station at Kubu. It failed, but imagine if it had succeeded. There wouldn't be Cape Town. Failure to explore the goals of the outside interventionists, especially the big powers and the bankers. But remember, you can always vote Democrat for a kinder, gentler imperialism. They drop their bombs and use their drone strikes with far more kindness. Don't explore the peace proposals. Don't offer any image of a peaceful outcome. Confuse a ceasefire and negotiation with actual peace. Always admit reconciliation as a viable option. So propaganda does not need to be true as long as it's plausible. Sometimes it can tell the truth, but withhold the point of view from the other side to create a distorted perspective. Half-truths are also dangerous, remember. Now, how do you prepare a nation for war? There's a crisis. We're on the brink of war. War is inevitable. The enemy leader is demonic. I mean, just think of this. Iraq, Russia, Putin. And notice, it's all about the person concerned, whereas others have said, it doesn't matter if Vladimir Putin is president. No Russian government could tolerate Ukraine being turned into a NATO state, having American missiles and American bases or NATO on its doorstep. This isn't a personal thing of Putin. Any Russian leader would have to oppose America's intervention. It's like when Russia was trying to put Russian bases and missiles in Cuba. Whoever was president of America would have had to intervene. It wasn't just John F. Kennedy had a personal beef against Russian missiles in Cuba. No American president could have allowed Soviet missiles in Cuba at that time. And so the way how they demonized the enemy leader, somehow him, or, Saddam Hussein is a threat to the world, whereas there's no evidence that he was at all. And then you demonize every single individual of the enemy. And atrocities, you make up stories, you whip up and strengthen emotional reactions. Do you remember Saddam Hussein's forces came into Kuwait and there was this weeping woman describing how they came into the baby's ward in the hospital and just picked up where the babies are kept in these life support. Sorry? They're picking up incubators, shaking the babies out on the floor, babies are dying on the floor, and they're carrying out, they're just literally incubators. Do you remember that story? It turned out the person wasn't a nurse, was not an eyewitness, was not a Kuwaiti. Was the daughter of the Kuwaiti ambassador to America who had aspirations of acting, and this was her debut. Total fraud. And then you had lies, lies, and more lies. George Bush Sr. saying, I saw with my own eyes on television. Seeing something on television is not seeing with your own eyes. I mean, do you believe Star Wars is history? Is there planet far, far away? But I saw with my own eyes on the screen. But Star Wars is not a true story. The camera does lie, actually. And it seems the actors do too. So they make up stories. And then it's the crisis. The negotiations are failing. We're on the brink of war. War is inevitable. The demon, the leader of the enemy is a demon. He's evil. And all the individuals are evil. I mean, just think, your vote was a hate crime. When people voted for Trump the first time, your vote's a hate crime. So much for democracy. I hate whites, cracker killers. Die, whites die. People are ungovernable. He's going down. Extermination for all you cockroaches coming up next. Love it when you cry. And this is during the whole BLM nonsense. The alt-right should be exterminated. That's the alternative right-wing movement. Kill Whitey. This Jew will replace you. We are replacing you. Your grandchildren are going to be brown. Kill white people. I mean, this is how propaganda works. This is swear words, you scum. Smash the white man march. Anti-fascism. And by the way, these guys were funded by USAID. BLM and Antifa were funded by millions by USAID. And then you make up stories to whip up emotions and strengthen emotional reactions. like a jackboot with a swastika crushing your church. Well, actually, the US government's managed to do that quite happily without any foreign agency involved. Just in the last 4 years, 100 churches in America have been attacked. Sorry, I've got it wrong. 300 churches in America have been attacked, and 100 pro-life groups, agencies, Christ Pregnancy Centers, and so on have been attacked. And the FBI has investigated 2 of those attacks. No prosecutions of any. It turns out USAID was funding the crushing of churches. FBI was recruiting spies to infiltrate churches and choirs and pro-life groups. Nightly observed, the media demands that we trust it, but all too often that trust has been betrayed. No jokes. Hope, change? What hope and change? It's hype. And you even being spied on and you being intimidated and deplatformed, censored by the people in tech companies. Change you can believe in. The press service summarized propaganda strategies as incompleteness, inaccuracy, driving the agenda, milking the story, exploiting what you want to believe the best about yourself, perception management, reinforcing existing attitudes, simple repetitions, emotional phrases. And we've all had it from Hollywood. Incompleteness, inaccuracy, milk the story, like Avenge December the 7th. Well, if people had understood that the US government knew about the attack coming and deliberately withheld the information from the men on the ground because they wanted a lot of American ships sunk, they wanted a lot of American people killed to get America out of its, what do we call it, the neutrality, get them out of their hostility to interventionism and get them interventionist. And so the treachery of Franklin Delano Roosevelt's government would be really helpful. This Pearl Harbor film has got to be one of the worst pieces of propaganda out there. So emotional, such manipulation. And by the way, one of the beloved women in the film getting machine gunned, a nurse being machine gunned running on the streets. At no time did the Japanese strafe any civilians in the Pearl Harbor attack. Absolute falsehood. And even the American military have admitted that is total fraud. But that's an emotional key part of the film. Here's this lovely nurse running down the street and machine gun bullets spreading all around the place, and she dies as a result. All is designed to milk the story and to get you to hate the enemy. And this Pearl Harbor is not accurate in the slightest. It was such propaganda. It was whipping the people up into hysteria, a typical American film to design to recruit people to the military. Exploiting that we want to believe the best about ourselves. And perception management. Reinforcing existing attitudes, simple repetitions and emotional phrases. I mean, this is meaningless. Let us go forward together. That sounds like an ANC slogan, but Churchill did first. You know, forward together. I mean, what does that mean? While they go backwards and not together either. Words are weapons in warfare. Propaganda involves word games, name calling of the target nation by labeling people. Do you remember when all Japs were chinks? Germans were krauts, short after sauerkraut and things like this. The Germans called the British Tommies, which is not exactly unfriendly. But I mean, they would have such nasty, repetitious names back. Labeling people, labeling groups, labeling institutions in a negative manner. Euphemisms are used to pacify the audience with bland meanings and connotations. Pacification. Pacification means dropping hundreds of thousands of tons of bombs and incendiaries on an area, on a city, on civilians. Technical incursion is the same thing as an illegal invasion. Civilian casualties are collateral damage. That sounds kind of nice. You incinerate 80,000 people in one city, that's collateral damage. No, it wasn't. They were the targets. Murder is replaced with liquidation. Terror bombing of a city is called saturation bombing or strategic bombing. Strategic bombing campaign. But I will set no wicked thing before my eyes. In recent times, the internet allows campaigns and channels of disinformation and misinformation. So this isn't just newspapers and films anymore. And they do false flags, and they do have agent provocateurs who seek to discredit the enemy. This happens in America in particular. You will have a demonstration and somebody who's not known to have anything to do with this group drives a car through the protesting mob, whipping the people into frenzy. This is almost certainly an own goal, where they do it to themselves in order to make themselves the victims. They were marching, like Antifa had a car drive into them, and the person is blamed one of the right-wing extremists, but almost certainly not. And all of these different atrocities, they are crying wolf, hate crimes and hoaxes in America, primetime propaganda. A lot of these things are documented. They character assassinate those whom they target. It's not enough to kill people, cripple people, hurt people, burn their homes and destroy their things. You've got to destroy their character. And so they come out with sex scandals, financial scandals. They can suck it out their thumb. So the Frankfurt School of Marxism recognized that to succeed anywhere, they need to have a termite strategy, rot out the inner core of the cultural institutions in the West, infiltrate education, entertainment, news media. Just think of a wooden building, just think of these wooden pillars. If you've got some termite eating the insides of it, you could put paint on the outside, it wouldn't change the fact that the pillars are being eroded. And at one point, everything's going to collapse. And so these cultural Marxists are working for a slow, gradual, long-term, culminative revolution, infiltrating the 5 cultural-carrying, culture-transforming institutions of the West. And that's what USAID has been funding. Educational institutions, roads must fall. The 5 pillars of liberal faith: hysteria, denial of reality, thought control, name-calling, and projection of guilt. Have you noticed they'll often accuse you of what they're doing? Manufacturing consent through the media, propaganda in the public mind. It's documented. They continually hate you. We need to understand the times. We need to know what God's people should do. History matters. Truth matters. We need to get back to the Bible, and we need discernment. You shall know the truth, and the truth shall set you free. We are more than conquerors through Christ Jesus who loved us. We need to submit to God, resist the devil, and the devil will flee from us. We need to stand up, step out, fight the good fight of faith. Greater is Jesus who is in us than him who is in the world. Who will rise up for me against the wicked? Who will take a stand for me against the workers of iniquity? Psalm 94, verse 16. The goal is to smash cultural Marxism. And I think it's going to be easier now because so much of them has been disinvested in. It looks like Elon Musk and President Trump have cut the funding. And so a lot of leftist causes in South Africa are going to be running around short of money now. And you can see that, I mean, there's been no grassroots support for the LGBTQ and so on movements. They've only been operating as effectively as they have because they've been getting lots of taxpayers' money looted from the taxpayers in America. And so now is the time to bring down the enemy idols. And this has been documented quite well in Agenda 2, The Masters of Deceit. And I've given many examples in my book, Behind Enemy Lines of Christ, of how the news media was diametrically opposed to what was actually happening on the ground in Rwanda and Mozambique and Sudan, Nigeria, the Congo.